This morning, two people armed with a pistol flew to the roof of the high-security Santi prison and helped an inmate escape who was serving an 18-year sentence for armed robbery.
This was the message that appeared in the pages of the Parisian newspapers on May 26, 1996. It was about the so-called King of Escapes, 34-year-old Mishele Zhuura. This man, during his long criminal career, had already successfully escaped from prison for the 5th time. Of course, by illegal means. But it seems that this particular escape was undoubtedly the most daring of them all. Just like in the best romance novels, the success of this escape was thanks to love. In total, Mishel Zhuura ended up in prison 12 times. He first ended up behind bars in 1970 when he was only 19 years old. At that time, the young man lived in the Anshampan wagon not alone, but with his wife named Ziba, as well as their little daughter. One day, the police came to their house. They arrested Mishel, accusing him of stealing a car. The man was indeed guilty of this crime. The night before, he was coming home from a party, and, so to speak, borrowed someone else's car without telling the owner. Mishel often did this before, but by morning he always returned the car to its place. However, that time Zhuura was too tired after dancing and drinking, so the boy overslept and didn't have time to return the car, while its owner obviously didn't oversleep, so in the morning he couldn't find his car and turned to the police. They rather quickly found the trail of the thief, but they still couldn't catch the man. The thing is, when Mishel realized that the cops had come to his house, he asked his wife to distract them, and in the meantime, he escaped through the window. After that incident, the man successfully hid from justice for 2 weeks, but in the end, the fugitive was finally caught. For stealing a car and escaping, Mishel was sentenced to 3 years in prison. In addition, he was banned from entering the 21st Department of France for 5 years. After learning about the sentence, Ziba, Zhuura's wife, decided that she did not want to tie her whole life to a criminal. She left the house where she lived with Mishel, and taking her daughter with her, moved to Bouches-du-Rhône, that is, to the very department that Zhuura was forbidden to enter. When Mishel was released in 1972, he wanted to see his daughter. So, he decided to win back Zibi's favor at any cost. At first, he simply called his ex. Well, not exactly simply, let's say obsessively. And when he realized that the woman was ignoring all his calls, he disregarded the restraining order and went to her new place of residence. On the way, Michel's car broke down, and just a few minutes later, the man noticed a police car approaching him. He absolutely did not want to meet with the police. He had already crossed the border of the Bouches-du-Rhône department, so he knew this would have its consequences. And serious ones. So Mr. Mishel quickly left the car and ran away before the police could notice him. It seemed that everything should have been fine for Mishel, but there was a little hairy but for him again. The thing is, the man had left all his documents inside the car. But despite the failure, Mishel was not going to give up on his plans, and after getting away from the police, he stole another car. But he couldn't drive it for long, because soon other patrol officers stopped the car. The man, realizing that he didn't have a driver's license or proof of ownership for the car, again, still tried to escape. But the law enforcement officers, let's say, began to actively pursue him, and after a short period of time, this chase ended with another arrest of Zhuura. After getting to know the other prisoners, the man noticed that some of them, thanks to good behavior, have the opportunity to work at jobs that, let's say, provide good chances for escape. One of these jobs was loading and unloading trucks that were parked right next to the exit from the prison. Mr. Zhuura managed to make a deal with one of the so-called model prisoners and took his place on the shift instead of him. Finding himself near the exit, he successfully escaped. I understand, right now this may seem very unrealistic to you, but let me remind you that these events took place in the 1970s. The security system back then wasn't as reliable as it is now. After the escape, Zhuura abandoned the idea of getting his wife back or even seeing his daughter. But he didn't plan to get involved with a criminal. By the way, it's interesting what exactly pushed Mishel to such a way of life. Well, besides the obvious reasons, of course, like quick results, so to speak, in the form of money. I would gladly listen to the conclusion of some psychotherapist who could talk to him. And just imagine, if therapy had actually worked for the guy, he might have basically quit crime. Who knows? You know, for many people that's actually pretty scary. I mean, therapy. Even I myself, for years, basically thought that psychological help just wasn't for me. But when I finally decided to see a specialist, the world gradually started to not even become more colorful, but just feel more real. Personally, for me, it's like, for the first time in many years, I started to breathe normally again, after constantly feeling short of breath, like you're always like that, and then... Mishel returned home and started making a living by committing burglaries. He wasn't very successful in this business, at least not much, because soon he was caught red-handed and sent back to prison. This time he also tried to escape, but to get ahead of myself, I'll say that Mr. Vosur failed. You see, only after ending up in prison, Vosur spent a long time observing the territory during walks, and at some point he noticed a fence that was poorly guarded. The fence was high, but it didn't seem insurmountable, so Mishel decided to take advantage of this. He successfully climbed the fence, jumped down, and landed badly, breaking his ankle. After that, the drunkard was caught and sent to the hospital, but even this failed escape attempt ended up working in the drunkard's favor. After recovering, he returned to prison and realized that rumors about his escape had spread. Thanks to this, the man quickly found an accomplice among the other prisoners. By joining forces, the men somehow got hold of a hacksaw, which they used to saw through the bars on a window in one of the prison rooms. Then they tied together bed sheets to make a rope, which they used again. They descended successfully into the prison courtyard. Then, using the same road that Mishel had recently used to escape for the first time, they found themselves free. Despite the fact that the man was incredibly lucky every time, he never even thought about giving up illegal ways of making money. After the escape, he planned and carried out several robberies, but during one of them, Zhuura was caught again. At that time, he was already gradually gaining a reputation as the king of escapes, and not just among the prisoners. That's why the man was placed in a solitary cell with double bars and barbed wire on the windows. But it was impossible to keep the prisoner in such conditions for long. After a few days, Zhuura was transferred to the other prisoners. The two criminals who lived in the cell where Mishel was placed turned out to be very interested in getting out of prison early. The three men came up with an escape plan. First, they staged a fake argument with one of the guards, and while pushing him, secretly took the cell key from him. A few minutes later, just as discreetly, they returned it back. During this short period, one of the accomplices quickly pressed the key onto a pre-prepared piece of wax. Later, the prisoners got iron, a file, and a kettle, melted the metal in their cell, and made a duplicate key. Imagine that. I still haven't found any info on where they got all those things. But who knows? Maybe back then prisoners could get them legally, or maybe their friends on the outside secretly passed them to the escapees. One way or another, that's the point. After several weeks of work, Mishel Zhuura and his accomplices left the cell. He managed to get past all the other obstacles and once again escaped from prison and found himself free. Very soon he ended up behind bars again, and this time Mishel was under constant surveillance. Besides that, he was often moved from one prison to another in order to actually prevent another escape. In 1979, while in prison, Mr. Zhuura met a woman named Nadine. She was the sister of one of Mishel's cellmates. Later, Ms. Nadine and Zhuura became a couple, and then they got married. From time to time, Nadine would come to visit her husband. As a result, the couple had a daughter together. It seemed that Mishel had finally calmed down and was now ready to accept just punishment for his crimes and then be released to enjoy family life. But that was only how it seemed because Zhuura did not want to wait. One day, Mishel was brought to court for another hearing in one of his cases, of which there were quite a few. And it was then that he managed to escape, but this time not from the prison, but from the courthouse. Using a toy gun, Mishel took the judge hostage and thanks to this was able to avoid being detained and hide from law enforcement. After this incident, he was in hiding for 2 long years, quite successfully. And probably no one will be surprised if I say that during this period, Mishel continued to commit crimes. In 1980, while fleeing from the police, he shot a police officer in the leg, and in 1981, he robbed a bank. Mr. Zhuura was again arrested and sentenced to 18 years in prison, being sent to the high-security wing of the Santé prison in Paris. However, you may have already noticed that as soon as Mishel lost his freedom, he immediately started thinking about how to get it back. And of course, this time was no exception. On May 26, 1985, around 10 a.m., a helicopter was spotted over the center of Paris. It was flying very low, and several times the radio operator asked to increase altitude, but all these requests were ignored. A few minutes later, the helicopter stopped right above the roof of the Santé prison. The guards of the correctional facility, who had been warned about the helicopter over the radio, were shocked by the event, but they were much more concerned about the situation that was unfolding at the same time inside the prison walls. You see, somehow 2 inmates had managed to get hold of several grenades, and right now they were threatening to blow up part of the prison if anyone came near them or opened fire on them. These inmates were the already familiar to us Mishele Zhuura and one of his cellmates by the name of Hernandez. These 2 men, holding grenades in their hands, ran out onto the roof of the correctional facility without any obstacles and approached the helicopter. Inside, 2 accomplices were already waiting for them, one of whom was armed and also threatening the guards. Fearing an explosion, none of the staff dared to stop Zhuura from climbing up the rope that was thrown down to him from the helicopter. When Mishel was on board, Hernandez changed his mind about escaping at the last moment. He surrendered to the police. Hernandez confessed to the police that what he had in his hands were not grenades, but simply nectarines painted green. You might be curious how Mishele Zhuura managed to pull off such a daring action escape. Well, in fact, it all happened thanks to his wife, Mrs. Naden Zhuura. You see, during her life, she also ended up in the police's line of sight several times. She was detained, but the case never made it to court. In 1983, in the last century, Mrs. Naden, already married to Mishel, ended up in the Fleury-Mérogis prison near Paris. She ended up there on suspicion of theft. Because of her marriage, the woman was released, but during the time spent behind bars, Nadine learned that a few years earlier, 2 prisoners had made a very spectacular escape from Fleury-Mérogis, using, in fact, a helicopter. After learning the details of this case and wanting to free her husband Nadine, together with them, began to develop an escape plan, which took the couple about 3 years. During this time, Nadine, using forged documents, enrolled in helicopter piloting courses. The woman diligently attended every class and always paid for it in cash. 1 hour of flight cost about $300, and the course itself lasted for almost 5 months. Finally, after spending a lot of resources and effort, Nadine managed to master the necessary skills and decided to take action. On May 26, on the day of the escape, she, as always, came to her lesson and rented the same helicopter she had been learning to fly all this time. This did not arouse any suspicion in anyone. Later, witnesses reported that on that day, together with the woman, there was a man who was carrying a large sports bag. Most likely, the bag contained the weapon. The identity of Nadzina's accomplice is unknown. His name is simply not being disclosed. After renting the helicopter, they got into the cabin and flew to the prison. It was to this prison where Mishel was already waiting for them with painted nectarines. After all 3 of them managed to escape and shake off the pursuit, Nadzin directed the helicopter to the nearest sports field, and there the accomplices got into a car that had been parked nearby in advance. But no matter how well thought out and effective this escape plan was, the subsequent actions of Naden and Mishel turned out to be not so prudent. Not only did they stay in Paris, where law enforcement was actively searching for them, but they also didn't keep a low profile. Instead, they began robbing banks, though they weren't immediately apprehended. 3 months after the escape, the couple, together with their accomplices, managed to successfully rob 2 out of 3 banks. But during the last robbery, the police opened fire, the horse was hit, and Mishel was shot. In the head.
The wound was very serious. My brain was working at 100%. I saw pants, grass, the sun, and drops of my own blood. I was conscious, my breathing was getting deeper. Then the police officer said, and I thought about the fact that actually I'm much more alive than he is. After that, I lost consciousness.
As a result of the injury, Mishel fell into a coma, but a week later he regained consciousness. And as soon as I recovered, he was immediately returned to prison. For the escape, Zhuura was later sentenced to an additional 17 years in prison. They managed to detain his wife, Naden. For assisting in the escape, the woman was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Later, Naden was asked about the reasons for her actions, and she answered like this.
If it were necessary, I would do it again.
Sadly, Naden and Mishel's love was brief. They separated in the early 1990s. After serving her sentence, Nadina published a book called The Air Girl. In it, she described her story, and later she practically disappeared from the public eye, and now she tries to avoid the public altogether. As for Mr. Mishel, in 1991, while serving his sentence behind bars and undergoing diagnostics, he met a 21-year-old woman of Algerian descent named Jamilia. She and Mishel corresponded for some time. Eventually, they fell in love with each other, and then Jamilia took a desperate step to get Zhuura out of prison. In 1993, the woman twice took a helicopter pilot hostage in order to literally repeat Naden's plan and get Mishel out of prison. But this time, all attempts ended in failure, and in December 1996, Ms. Jamilia appeared before the court. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison, although she served only 5. Shortly before her release in 1999, she officially married Zhuura. Around the same time, Mishel had his sentence reduced by as much as 16 years. The man was released from prison in 2003 over his lifetime. The King of Escapes spent a total of 27 long years behind bars. This time, after being released, the man finally changed his outlook on life and left crime behind. Now he lives in the suburbs of Paris together with Jamilia and a dog named Marius. Mishel converted to Islam to gain acceptance from his wife's family. He also actively practices yoga, leads a completely law-abiding life, and earns a living by working at a small publishing house. Judging by everything, Mishel no longer communicates with Naden. Such a conclusion can be drawn based on the latest interview that I, in fact, gave to Azure. In it, he mentioned the 2 children who were born to him during his marriage to Nadine. There, he stated that he does not communicate with them and has not seen them for a very long time. Well, my dears, that's the story for today. I would even say it's a bit romantic. But don't forget that crime is still crime after all. Stay healthy and see you in the next video.